Hi everyone and welcome. What you see here is my oldest worm bin. I believe its age is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 172, 173 days old. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since April 16th?
It was 173 days ago.
Right, so this bin started 173 days ago, and then I got it up to its 15th feeding, at which point I decided that it was going to be its last feeding. I gave it 3 weeks, so 21 days to do what I consider as foraging, which is just not giving the worms any food, letting them just work through whatever remains in the bin as little leftovers and scraps. And then it was 18 days ago that we started the migration of the worms out of the compost. So to do that, I feed on only one edge of the bin, and in this case it's this closer edge right here, getting the food. So 18 days ago I loaded up this edge of the bin with some food, and then 8 days ago I came back in here after 10 days and kind of refreshed the food. So today, after 18 days of migration, the only significance of 18 days is the fact that it was only on one occasion that I was able to get all the worms to migrate out of the finished compost in 18 days. That was maybe a year and a half ago. I believe it might have even been with these same worms. And I'm not expecting that sort of performance today, but I figured, heck, if it's 18 days now, let's see how this bin is doing as far as migrating the worms out of the finished compost. And who knows, maybe we're getting close, but my guess is that it's not going to be quite there yet. It's probably going to need a little bit more time. But I've kind of gotten into the habit of checking in on migrations at day 18 just to see if there's any chance that I might be at least tying my previous record. So I'm going to get that bin up onto the bench and we're going to see how things are progressing. So this is the second day in a row that I'm just checking in on a bin, not coming down here with the intention of feeding the bin, just see how it's coming along. While in the case of this bin, we're checking in on the migration of the worms out of the finished compost. And the bin that I checked yesterday, I was simply checking on how the progress of the foraging was coming along, as far as, whether it was time yet to initiate the migration of the worms out of the material, or do I want to let the foraging continue. And the one thing about the bin that I worked on yesterday is that it's the collection of mixed types of worms in that other bin that I did yesterday. That has some red wigglers, some European night crawlers, but primarily, I think the main occupant of that bin is the Indian blue worms. And I tell you, nowadays, I don't know if it's always been that way, but whenever I go in there and I try to do something in the bin, whether I'm feeding it, checking on it, whatever the case may be, I always find that the blue worms are just crawling all over the top of the material right after I'm done working on it. A lot of times they start climbing too. So yesterday I set up a time lapse of my bin to shoot a single image every 2 seconds, I think. So for every minute of activity in real time, there was 1 second of fast motion playback time lapse. So I actually allowed the camera to run for 6 hours, observing the top surface of the material after the bin had been checked in on. And those worms were just cruising the surface the entire time. And I don't know if it's just something that always happens, and I've just never taken note of it until most recently. But I've always thought that, once you finish working on a worm bin and you put it back up on the shelf, everything's good to just continue without any reason for concern. But more recently, I've been sensing that after I do a worm bin maintenance check of any type, I often wonder nowadays whether I've disrupted the worms in such a fashion that it's going to cause them to want to start climbing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And I don't mind them climbing. My main concern about the climbing behavior is that they're going to just end up outside of their bin on a very dry tabletop or on the dry floor, and that they're just going to end up drying out there, and I don't want that to happen to any of my worms. So I've just kind of dismantled this plastic covering, which was forcing the recirculation of all the moisture down there in the feeding area. Doing a really good job, because you can see how soaked this piece of paper is. This is just a coffee filter, but it was resting right on top, catching all the dripping moisture coming down off the plastic as it condenses and recollects, and as you can see, the worms definitely enjoy the dampness. I pretty much remember leveling things off here last time we checked in here. So it does seem like the level over here on the feeding area side has dropped some, which kind of makes sense between settling and depletion of the food that was put in there, food and bedding. In time, it's not unusual to see the level drop a little bit. So let's just evict all these little guys off this piece of cardboard so I can get the cardboard out of our way as well. And I think we can start checking out how this migration of the worms out of the finished compost is progressing. Give us some indications of where to take this next. So I'm pretty sure it was my African night crawlers once upon a time, I don't know how long ago. For some reason I think it was in my vermibag tote that I was somehow able to get the worms to all collect in the feeding area in the course of only 18 days. And who knows, maybe the day prior, if I had come in sooner, maybe I would have found that it was actually all done even sooner. Maybe it only took 16 or 17 days for the worms to migrate out of the finished compost. And I did go looking through that finished compost at the end to see if I could find any straggler worms, and I found absolutely nothing. So to me, an 18-day migration of the worms out of the finished compost is a record, and one that I don't even know if I'm gonna ever see again. I don't know if it was just a set of fortunate circumstances that all seemed to line up just perfectly in that case, helping that process to really occur quickly. This looks like the stem of a banana, shredded. But let's keep it over where we think the action's going to be. Because obviously here, this is, the idea of this stuff here is that it's pretty much finished compost, and that there's not a whole lot of remaining bedding or food left here for the worms to enjoy. Hopefully serving as motivation for the worms to move out. So I'm just kind of inspecting the side of the migration on this side of the little divider, because it's this side that was stocked with food and fresh bedding. I'm just curious to see what's going on over on this side, where I'm hoping to see virtually no worms at this point. And wouldn't it be interesting if we actually had sort of a tie? If there was really no remaining worms in this material, and that they'd actually all moved out on their own. Barring just a couple exceptions. If I spot one or two worms, I've got no problem moving them over. But it's sort of sampling the material. I mean, maybe there are just no more worms in this stuff. I feel like I just sort of scooped in underneath where the divider was, and I scooped some worms back over into the finished compost side on that one, so I don't think that really counted. So I've just got to kind of make a judgment on each handful to see if it was really the finished compost that I found the worm in, or did I actually accidentally scoop one over from the baiting area. But I would say that in general, this material looks very, very worm-free. Here and there I'm seeing little baby worms. Looks like we got a couple little ones here. Anytime I spot one, I'll probably just move it over. And as far as what my goals for today were, it was really nothing more than just to check in, And naturally, I've got to sort of be prepared for different situations. If there's something that does require me to react instantly, some sort of, really problematic situation going on, naturally I'll do whatever's needed to address any sort of concerns. But my whole goal with today was just to get a sense of how much longer I think that this migration needs before I could really treat this side of the bin, all the material on this side of the bin, as just finished compost, and trust that the majority of the worms have moved out at this point so that I could situate them in some new home, which I'm not really prepared to do quite yet. I guess that would have been one of the eventualities that could have been the outcome of today's check-in, is that hey, maybe they did all move over, and maybe I do need to be prepared to, position all the worms that have made their way over onto this side of the bin into some new space. But as you could probably guess, I'm not prepared to do that today. I'm definitely finding worms here and there, but I'm still questioning whether they're worms that I'm pulling out of the somewhat more damp stuff that's right here on the edge. Somehow last time we checked in here, I did manage to preserve this little dividing wall that I placed in here. It's just a piece of cardboard, but it was punched full of holes. So I'm just wondering if I could sort of pick this thing out of here in such a way that it doesn't tear. And maybe just continue using it for one more short run to let the last of the little worms move out of this finished compost. And then we could just sort of sign off on this as a done deal. And the next step for something like this, I believe, would be to not really treat the finished compost as something to be used quite yet. Not to say that there'd be a problem with it, because you could take this stuff straight out to the garden and give it to your plants and they'll love it. But the only, I guess, drawback of doing that is missing the opportunity to let this stuff sit just a little while longer so that all the cocoons that are probably left behind within this material by all the adult worms that moved out, all the cocoons have yet to hatch, and all those baby worms that would come from those cocoons would be really nice to maintain as members of my worm colony versus simply releasing them out into the wild. So that's kind of what I'm after here, is to eventually get to some point where I can not only relocate all the worms to some new space, but then soon thereafter I can also round up all the babies that they left behind within the finished castings in the form of cocoons still at that time. But once those all hatch and we've got baby worms, then they could all just be sort of reintegrated into their original population that they stemmed from. So obviously catching worms right down here in the middle is not surprising. We're definitely close though, you got to admit. In a lot of cases people would just say, you know, heck dude, you got so little left as far as worms in that material, I would just, you know, consider this as a done migration. But I'm in no hurry. I've got no problem allowing this to just continue a little while longer. Probably not much longer though. At which point we could probably do a similar sort of screening through of the material, just to pick through it a little bit, see if we could find any more worms that shouldn't be left behind, let them stay with their family and their friends, and then give this material here a chance just to sit for a while. And then eventually we'll hopefully be able to round up baby worms out of it after it sort of served that function of being what I refer to as cocoon nursery. So my only thing about this dividing wall piece of cardboard is that it's really far gone. And I'm debating whether I really want to fashion a new piece for here, but you know what? It doesn't take too long. Why don't I do that right now? And what we could use to replace this is what we had resting right out here on top a moment ago. It's the piece that was covering. It was also catching a lot of moisture, but it's still somewhat intact. It didn't get nibbled away the way this one did. And I think it would serve as a really nice replacement for the dividing wall that was there before. Like I said, it's not really a dividing wall. It's just sort of a visual aid for me to see where one section of the bin ends and the next section of it begins. But you know what? Let's not jump the gun here. We want to perforate this a little bit. So I've got my handy little mini rake, or whatever you want to call this thing here. I thought it would be really easy to punch some holes with this thing 3 at a time, but it doesn't seem to be cooperating. So I'll do what it takes to get this thing perforated a little bit and try to not destroy it in the process. Alright, wow. It looks like it's sort of delaminating into separate layers now with all that rough handling. Kind of taking those holes that I just created all sort of out of alignment with one another. But whatever, I don't think it's that big of a deterrent that if a worm tries to make its way through that cardboard, it's not going to succeed, or even if it goes through partially and finds itself enjoying being in there between the layers of the corrugated, then whatever. The key is to get them out of this stuff over here. And as you can see, a couple of them are clearly visible on the surface, and I bet you there's more mixed in here, but probably not many. But you know what? before we reset this thing and let it continue for a little while longer, I just can't seem to resist. I really want to see how things are holding up in here. And I guess the one thing we can do is possibly replenish the food supply in here if it's necessary to do so. Because I can always throw in a little bit more bedding, a little bit more food to help encourage this process to continue. And I mean, if we've got the entire population of this bin loaded up in this 1/3 of the container all the way here on the edge, I would think that they're going to burn through food pretty quickly there. Here's like the end of a corn cob, little tip of a corn cob that I cut into little pieces for them. So that's a little piece of slow composting leftover food. Here are some bedding bits. I see bedding bits, but I don't see any leftover food scraps. There probably isn't much. I mean, it's not unusual to find a chunk of corn cob as leftovers in a worm bin. It'll remain in the bin for weeks usually before it gets completely consumed, even if it's chopped up into little chunks the way I've got it there. But it might be a good idea to just throw in a little bit more food just to make sure that this process continues efficiently going forward. I'm sure that there's plenty of food in here just the way it is. The worms are not going to have a problem, but I've got this whole thing kind of upturned here anyway, and it certainly wouldn't take much effort to just drop in a little bit more food. I even thought about maybe building it up with a bit more bedding too. Here's a banana stem. So there are little bits of leftover in here, but you know what? I will go up to the fridge. I'll grab just a couple things to throw in here to help this continue, and then we'll be done in here. Give these little guys a break. Hopefully they'll not start going rampant and start running around the entire bin, freaking out because of the disruption I just made here. But yeah, it's gonna be a couple minutes. Just gotta run upstairs. We'll grab something to throw in here, and then we'll be finished. Well, I went up to the freezer, and this frozen banana peel called out to me. It seemed like the perfect thing to throw in here as the sort of the dessert to the end of this migration. I don't think it's going to require a whole lot more time, but it seems like a really nice little treat to throw in here for these little guys. It is frozen, but I think that they can just kind of squirm away from it if it's just happened to be in contact with any worms after I drop it in here, and they can get out of harm's way and then come back to it once it's thawed out and it's ready for consumption. It always makes me wonder how long it takes before something like this is in fact ready for consumption. Sometimes it seems like they can go right at something almost immediately. Sometimes it seems like they need a little bit of time for that stuff to start breaking down a little bit before the worms can actually have at it. So we'll see leftovers of these bits of banana peel, I'm certain of it, next time we come in here. And that's a pretty good size portion of food, but maybe not, you know. I mean, if you think about it, you've got an entire worm bin, or an entire bin's worth of worms populating this little portion of the container here. And it's probably not a big deal for them to rip into that and make a pretty big dent in it in a pretty short period of time. So if this goes in as our partition wall, this can sort of take the place of the old covering, but instead of covering, we'll actually place it down here as supplementary bedding. How does that sound? That should make for a really nice cozy spot for the worms to come hang out in. Maybe we cover it up with some of this existing stuff right here. It does feel to me like I've actually increased the size once again of my feeding area here a little bit by doing this maintenance check, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. I'll just sort of rebuild it more or less the way we found it when we got in here, and then we'll let it continue. Let's gradually backfill this little dividing cardboard with all the nice finished castings. We didn't really go ripping too much into the far end of the bin over here to see what we could see, but that could actually be one of the more telling things, is if we go to the very, very far edge and find no worms, that could also end up being a good sign. And hopefully they're mostly over close to where the action is. But you know, here and there I'm finding a couple. Doesn't matter, you know. I mean, at some point you are going to have to just call it quits and say, you know, the migration is now officially done. Any worms remaining in the material lingering behind will just be there to sort of welcome the next generation once the cocoons begin hatching. But you got to admit, for what we're finding in here, it does seem like this migration has a little bit further to go, just based on the number of worms we've encountered already in here from looking at this very, very far edge of the bin. You've already seen me move maybe half a dozen or so worms over that I've encountered. So it does seem sensible that this bin is going to take more than 18 days to get completely evacuated of its worm population and its finished castings. So many different variables, you know. If the stuff were really dry, that would serve as a good motivator to get the worms to split. But then again, if the stuff is full of all kinds of leftover bits of food and bedding and moisture, then the worms would not really have a good reason to want to sort of get moving and look for a better place to be. They might be content just to hang out in this stuff. And that's the main reason I've been sort of allowing it to dry, not covering it up very thoroughly, just giving it a certain amount of access to the air so that it has something into which it can expel its moisture through evaporation. So I don't know, I just see little chunks of stuff. I feel like I want to throw it over into the feeding area. So this is it. Let's allow this system some more time to continue kind of just the way it is. Got to get this covered back up again here. What do we got? We've got this leftover piece of coffee filter. A little bit tattered up from worm traffic, I assume. A little bit chewed away. Be nice to cover this up a little bit more thoroughly before we put the plastic back on. Oh, I know. I just happen to have 2 more coffee filters here. All set to go. So we'll just kind of spread them out. Use them to give our feeding area a nice cover. As you saw, the worms like to kind of cruise up to the top surface and seek out the moisture that's collecting and accumulating right below the plastic covering. So I like having stuff out here for the moisture off that plastic to collect onto, and this will be a nice little landing pad for it. So let's return this plastic. I think each time I do this I have to sort of expand its size just to cover thoroughly in here. But you don't need much. You saw how much moisture was in there. It was plenty. It was doing a great job recirculating. So I think we're in good shape here for this process to continue a little while longer. And let's get this little wormy close to where we want them to be. So I'm wondering how much longer it's going to take for the last of these worms to cruise out of this stuff. I'm just continuing to cover it only with these pieces of paper here and the cardboard on top of that, in the hopes that over here things can continue to dry, and then the remaining moisture and stuff over here will hopefully serve as an attractant so that the worms eventually end up over there, and then they can round them all up and get them into a new home. So that's it. We don't have a whole lot to do here as far as cleaning up. Just got to rinse off my glove and I'm good to go. I'll put this away and take care of all that other stuff, but that's boring. I'm not going to waste your time with that. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.